Everybody, welcome back to the Seagull Football Network. I'm Braden. My brother Ben is on, and today we have a special guest. One of our editors, Jack, is joining us. We're going to start off with some news. First up, we have some NFC North news. I know we just covered them last week. They decided they needed to do some more stuff right after we talked about them. So, the first thing is Taylor Decker signed a 3-year, $60 million extension. Solid offensive tackle, locking him up for another 3 years. That's a really good option for them. The second one is wide receiver DJ Moore signed a 4-year, $110 million extension with the Chicago Bears. Obviously, he had a really great season last year, his career best. I've heard a couple people saying, like, oh, what if that season was a fluke? Is he going to actually have the same performance for 4 years? And it's the biggest extension the Bears have ever signed a player to. Ben, as a Bears fan, I want to hear your take on this.
Yeah, so here's my thoughts on DJ Moore. Sure, that was the most yards he's ever had in a season. But look, for the last 6 years now, he's had over or just under 1,200 yards. 3 of those 6 years. The 1,400-yard season this year, and then he had two 800, 900-yard seasons. If the Bears get even that kind of production for the next 4 years, that's a solid setup right there. And it's not like that deal is a bad one at all, even for less than what he put up last year. Obviously, that puts him, I believe, through 2027, which is the same contract that Caleb Williams is currently under. So it puts them both kind of on that offense for the next 4 years, which is some real good stability for that rookie.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I was impressed with what I saw from him last year. For you fantasy football people, he was the wide receiver 6 in total scoring. So that, hopefully he can keep up the same production and earn the contract. Third, we have Tristan Wirfs. Tristan Wirfs, offensive tackle for the Buccaneers, signed a 5-year, $140 million extension, making him the highest paid offensive lineman in NFL history. So that's a really big deal there. And then the last 3 bits of news I have are all injury related. First up, Geno Smith hasn't practiced since I think Tuesday. It's Friday today when we're recording. He has a hip/knee injury. The timeline is super unclear. I know he was having some imaging done yesterday. Still waiting to hear a little bit more on that. Next up, Titans wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins suffered a knee injury. He's expected to miss at least 4 weeks. There's a chance he misses the start of the season. Another big player to keep an eye on there. And then lastly, Justin Herbert has a plantar fascia injury in his right foot that is going to keep him in a walking boot for around 2 weeks, I believe. So some pretty impactful injuries there, big name players. Definitely something to keep an eye on as we get into the preseason and near the start of the season. All right. This week we are talking about the AFC East. We are going to start off with the Buffalo Bills. I'm going to pass it to Jack first as the guest. Jack, what do you have listed as the strength for the Buffalo Bills?
Okay, so for the strength, I actually have the Bills running game. I've been a big fan of James Cook since college. I thought he was going to be a fantastic running back when he took over for Donovan Singletary last season, once Donovan Singletary left and went to Houston, I believe. And I think with this team not having as good of a wide receiving core as they have the last 2-3 seasons, now that Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs are gone, I think they will rely heavily on the run game with James Cook and the running ability from Josh Allen. And they also did draft Ray Davis as well. And I think with the 3 of those, this running game will be what keeps the offense for the Buffalo Bills in games and competing with other teams as they face them.
Yeah, I was looking at Josh Allen's stats, and last season he had the most rushing touchdowns of any season in his career with 15, I believe. Really, really impressive numbers there. I hope they can start to lean more on the run game than they have the past couple seasons, because that's really been what they've been lacking, I think. So yeah, hopefully that's something that they can really rely on to help improve their offense. Ben, what about you? What do you have listed?
Yeah, so I went the opposite direction. I agree the run game is a very strong part of that team. Obviously, new offensive coordinator Joe Brady, after he came into the offensive coordinator position last year, their run game did, first of all, become a part of the offense, and secondly, greatly improve with James Cook, Josh Allen. They were very good in that type of offense. But I actually went the opposite direction. I said that the Bills' biggest strength is the defense. And I will go ahead and preface that's going to be kind of a theme here in the AFC East. But anyway, obviously, I think the Bills got knocked a lot in the offseason for having to make a lot of changes due to financials. But thankfully, they are running back nearly the same defense in terms of starters. Von Miller is now back. Everything coming out of training camp is that he's healthy. Greg Rousseau is an ascending pass rusher. I mean, he's shown flashes every year, and last year he was really solid. Ed Oliver is a game-wrecking player from the interior, great at run defense, pass rush. Obviously, they have him under a new contract. The secondary is full of homegrown talent at corner. Mike Edwards is a solid free agent signing from Kansas City. And obviously, this defense was fourth in points and ninth in yards last year. It was a very large reason why they won 6 of their last 8 games after a really rough start to the season. And they will be the same or better in 2024 based on what their defense is now looking like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of ties in with what I picked as the strength. I got a little bit more specific and went with their front seven as a whole. You named a lot of the players that I have listed here: Von Miller, Greg Rousseau, Ed Oliver. I also listed Matt Milano and Terrell Bernard. I think they've had really solid seasons. Um,
Yeah.
and then really whoever else fills in that front seven, whoever else they have as rotational, is going to do really, really well just with all those other names there. You don't have to be a superstar when you've got all those other names there. They're going to eat up a lot of the offensive power, and then you just have to be good enough to get in there and get some stats. I specifically was looking at their third
Mm-hmm.
rounder, Dwayne Carter. I think he's a defensive tackle. Really good opportunity for him to come in,
Yep.
learn, and grow with a solid defense. So, yeah, I agree. The defense is going to be solid. Nothing against their secondary either. I think their secondary is good, but I really wanted to focus on that front seven. I think they're going to be really, really vicious against offenses this season.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go.
Yeah, totally agree. Dwayne Carter is not Ed Oliver level, but on the college scene, he was a very good pass rushing defensive tackle. He needs to work on his hands some, but I think, like you said, as a rotational guy, he's going to be able to make a really good impact in Buffalo.
I'll go ahead and jump into my
Right.
weakness
Yeah.
because it kind of plays off of something Jack mentioned. I picked receivers. I don't like the receiver room for the Bills at all. As of right now, obviously, we haven't gotten down to the 53-man roster yet, so this is definitely going to change. But as of right now, they have 13 receivers on their roster. Only one of them is returning from the team last season. Of the 13, only 7 of them caught a pass in the NFL last year, and they combined all 7 of them for 1,816 yards and 7 touchdowns. There were 18 individual receivers who caught at least 7 touchdowns last season. This is really bad. It's not a good receiver room at all. It's full of a bunch of wide receivers, threes and fours, and there's nobody in there that I really feel is going to be that number one guy, except potentially Keon Coleman. But that's a lot of pressure to put on a rookie. That
Mm-hmm.
I'm, it, I just don't really know what that's going to
Mhm.
look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add on to that. Obviously, I also put receivers as my biggest weakness. I don't think that there really is another weakness like that on the Bills roster. They've got, some strengths, some weaknesses, but that is the worst part of their team by far. I believe Keon Coleman will be a very good receiver in short order. Obviously, he was taken in the second round, 33rd overall, first pick of the second round. But outside of him, they really just brought in a couple cast-offs from other teams. Curtis Samuel is good, but he's dealt with injuries. He's, I think, almost 30 now. I think he could be a good number 2 if he can stay healthy. Past him, we have Mac Hollins and Chase
Yeah.
Claypool. Both of those guys are always hyped in the offseason because they've got some, an incredible physique and they're huge. I think they're both 6'3", 6'4", but they've really yet to justify that hype by actually producing in the regular season. Not once, really. Past them, you've got Marquez Valdez Scantling. He was a decent rotational receiver in Kansas
Right.
City. but he's no alpha receiver. And there have already been murmurs out of training camp that he isn't impressing, and he's being surpassed by the likes of Andy Isabella, KJ Hamler, who are both former second round receivers. They were picked by rebuilding teams. They went through that rookie contract without really having a chance to prove themselves, right? And they're unlikely to really make an impact on Buffalo's roster now. The only other receiver that I think has the potential to truly make an impact in the passing game is former fifth rounder Khalil Shakir in Buffalo. He has the potential to step into that Gabe Davis #2 role, but I still think even going into his third year now, he needs some time to develop before he truly can play at that high level for them.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I took a look at each of the 7 receivers who caught passes last season, and I looked at their maximum yardage in a season. And Chase Claypool was actually number 1. It was his rookie season with 873 yards. So none of these receivers have even broken 1,000 in a season. And that's just not really a good look, especially in such a pass-heavy offense. Jack, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I also picked the receiving core for my biggest weakness.
Good thing we're agreeing on that.
I personally think that someone of the likes of like Dalton Kincaid might lead the team in receptions, yards, and touchdowns just because of how not great the receiving core is. But I do think Keon Coleman will break into, maybe not this year, but coming next year after, into that number 1 Stephon Diggs type of player. Now, I'm not saying he will be Stephon Diggs, but the number 1 type of, you can throw up a 50-50 ball and he comes down with it. I think he will develop into that guy. I just don't think there's really anybody on this team besides Dalton Kincaid or Dawson Knox that will actually have a great impact as a pass catcher on this team.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us up to the X factor. Ben, why don't you tell us who you have listed?
Yeah, it's actually a direct correlation to that biggest weakness we were just talking about. My X factor for the Buffalo Bills is Keon Coleman. Just like we talked about the receiving core being such a weakness, the key to turning that into a strength for the Buffalo Bills is second-round rookie Keon Coleman out of Florida State. He's built like a number 1 receiver. Like Jack was talking about, he's huge. He's got that 50-50 ball, physique. He's able to jump up and just get it no matter what kind of a throw it was. He routinely made highlight catches that put his team in prime position each and every game. Keon Coleman was that part of the offense that made Florida State a national championship contender last year. Obviously, he only put up 658 yards, 11 touchdowns. So even in college, he was there for those big catches, but he wasn't always getting the ball. So I do want to see more growth out of him, and it's going to have to happen quickly. However, if he does pan out at that speed and he pans out consistently, he can be an immediate impact player for Josh Allen, and I think he can single-handedly turn that receiving core weakness to somewhat of a strength.
Yeah, absolutely. Jack, what do you think?
I actually put Dalton Kincaid or whoever starts at tight end between him and Dawson Knox as the X factor. I think Dalton Kincaid is the better player between the two. I was high on him going into last season, and he didn't really disappoint me. And it mainly just builds off of what I said before. I do think the tight end will lead the team in receptions, yards, and touchdowns just because they don't really have that number 1. But going off of what Ben said, I do think that there is a potential that Keon Coleman could have a breakout year this year and prove a lot of people who are doubting him completely wrong. I do think that he could come in and be Josh Allen's best friend. We know Josh Allen loves throwing the ball as far as he possibly can. And I think that Keon Coleman can and will be that guy for him this year especially. I just don't think he's going to have what it takes to be that game changer year 1.
Yeah, I could see that being the case. I'll talk a little bit more about Keon Coleman here in a minute. But first, my X factor that I picked is actually just Josh Allen. I think a lot is resting on his shoulders. He has to be able to lead this offense. Obviously, he's lacking weapons compared to the last couple seasons he's had. And really, I was not impressed with his performance last year. I think if he repeats, even similar to what he did last year, I think there's a really good chance they miss the playoffs entirely. He finished with 29 touchdowns, which doesn't sound bad. 29 passing touchdowns, I should clarify, which is his lowest since 2019. And finished with 18 interceptions, which is his highest in a season so far. I think he still leads since entering the league in turnovers as well. I didn't double check that stat today.
Yeah,
But
so he did fumble 7 times, as well as the 18 interceptions. So
yeah. Now he also did tack on, like I mentioned, the 15 rushing touchdowns. So as far as the total scoring, he still had a good year last year. By no means was it terrible, but it was one of his worst seasons yet, and now he's lacking all the weapons that he had. So I just have some concerns about him actually still maintaining that scoring capability. But if the team is going to succeed, it has to be through him first. They have to be able to put points up on the board. Otherwise, they're going to be trying to keep games close with the defense, and that's just not a position they really want to be in.
yeah, for sure.
Ben, why don't you tell us who you picked for your notable rookie?
My notable rookie was a 5th rounder, actually. He was 141st overall out of Georgia. It is center Cedric Van Pran. Obviously, like I said, he was a 5th rounder, but he was only the 3rd true center selected in the draft, behind Jackson Powers Johnson, who went in the 2nd round to Las Vegas, and then Zach Frazier, who went 2nd to Pittsburgh. He was a starter on that championship-winning Georgia team for 3 years. All 3 years he started at center. And during that time, he proved himself as a consistent snapper, great instincts, and a really good understanding of pro-level blocking schemes, because Georgia runs a lot of pro-level types of plays, especially in the run game. He may have to work on his core strength against larger defensive linemen. He's a little bit on the small side in terms of weight, but he is ready to start on the NFL level. And I think he is very likely to get that chance with the Buffalo offensive line in week 1, because they did lose their starting center from last year, being Mitch Morse, who went to, I believe, Jacksonville. Jack?
Yeah, it was Jacksonville.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid pick there. I think it'd be impressive for a 5th round center to get the start early like that. I think that'd be a really good sign overall for him. Jack, what are your thoughts?
I do think he's a good center. I do think he will be able to fill the shoes of Mitch Morse quite well, especially once he develops. He was actually my 2nd pick. I ended up going with Keon Coleman out of FSU. I know we've talked about him a lot.
This guy keeps coming out
recently.
Yeah.
I was kind of hoping we didn't, but I did. I had him on my board as the 5th best wide receiver in the wide receiver class for this past draft. I thought
that's bold.
It is bold. It really is. But I thought, everybody knew the first 3 were going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Roman Dunze. Nobody quite knew the order. People were pretty sure they knew how it was going to go, but everybody knew those were going to be the best 3. And then I had Brian Thomas Jr. at 4 above Keon Coleman, but I could see Keon Coleman going before or whatever. But I did have Keon Coleman as the 5th best wide receiver in this class. And I did when, the way it worked is, they had 3 receivers go before him after Brian Thomas Jr. went to Jacksonville at 24. And those 3 were Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, and Ricky Pearsall. Not in that order, but I remember as Keon Coleman slipped, I was thinking to myself, night 1, I was like, okay, is there something I missed about like his draft profile that people just didn't like about him, or is it just teams that like these other guys more? And so when Buffalo picked with the first pick in the 2nd round, once they traded back a 2nd time, night 1 with the Panthers, and they were picking one, I was like, 2nd night, I was like, there's no way they don't go with who I thought was the 5th best receiver left on the board and the best receiver left on the board in that draft with Keon Coleman to fill the biggest need they had. And so I have him as notable rookie for the reason of it is their biggest need, but he will be that player, and I do think he'll have a better career than some of the three taken before him, and possibly maybe even better than Brian Thomas Jr. And I say that as a Jacksonville fan. So I'm really high on the guy, and I just think that when he comes together, will be unstoppable.
Yeah, I also have Keon Coleman. Obviously, we've talked about him a lot. I mentioned his size in my notes here. He's 6'4", 215 pounds. 11 touchdowns might not be the most ever, but I think it's a solid season. Good numbers there. And I guess the one thing I did want to bring up is I heard a lot of people saying, oh, I can't believe the Bills didn't get Xavier Worthy. Why would they trade back with the Chiefs and let their biggest rival in the AFC go and get him? But I really think that Keon Coleman is a better fit for what the Bills need right now than Xavier Worthy. Yeah, Josh Allen loves to throw the ball really far. Yeah. He's great at it. It's not what he needs to be doing right now. And they need that number one guy. They need a Stephon Diggs who's going to come in. He's going to run whatever route they need him to. Short routes, deep routes, medium routes. He's going to be good over the middle of the field. He's going to be good on the outside. They need somebody who can come in and just get yards down the field. And I think that's what Keon Coleman's going to be more consistent at than Xavier Worthy would be with the Bills.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I will say during the draft, I was a little bit more leaning toward Buffalo taking A.D. Mitchell there at 33. But Keon Coleman was a good selection. I think it was better than Xavier Worthy. Kansas City, we talked about with Green Bay, and Kansas City's the same way, how they kind of are looking for a bunch of guys who can perform and any one of them can be the number one guy any given week. Keon Coleman is much more of I'm going to be that X receiver, whereas Xavier Worthy fits into Kansas City's offense of just kind of rotating in and out, being kind of speedy, not always being that number one guy.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Jack, why don't you run through the biggest games for the Buffalo Bills that you picked out?
All right. So I started off. I will mention I have this for all four teams in the division. But I'm starting it off with the 6 divisional games. I think divisional games will always be important for every team in the NFL because they essentially pick if you'll make the playoffs and not more than any other team you'll face. And so I have it, but I have it specifically noted that I think the New York Jets will be most important for Buffalo. And I have that because I think that the Jets will win this division. And so because I think they're going to win the division. And I think that because I have them as the team to win the division, that they are the team that every team in this division needs to prepare for the most. Because I think they are one of the better teams in the AFC as a whole. We didn't really see it last year because Aaron Rodgers was hurt the entire year, and so they had lackluster quarterback play. But I think if Aaron Rodgers can stay healthy for them, and we'll get into this later when we talk about the Jets, I could very well see them making the playoffs as a 3 or 4 seed and potentially making it semi-far into the playoffs. So I have them specifically in the divisional games, but I think divisional games as a whole. Second off,
that's a spicy take.
It is. Second off, I have Week 3 versus Jacksonville on Monday Night Football. And I say this not just as a Jacksonville fan and wanted to talk about them, but I don't know if you guys know this, but in the 30 years that Jacksonville has been a team in the NFL, including the playoffs, they have a 10-9 win-loss record over Buffalo. And for the longest time, Buffalo was winning that, or it would be tied, or whatever. And especially recently, there's been kind of a Buffalo and Jacksonville rivalry, as sorts between fans at least. I don't know about the team itself, but I know fans and Buffalo kind of look at each other as we are so close win-loss ratio-wise that we just don't like the other team. But I specifically chose this team because I think Buffalo, like Jacksonville, has the potential to not only make the playoffs, but I don't think either one will win the division. And I could very well see it coming down to where Buffalo and Jacksonville finish with almost the exact same record. And it comes down to who wins the Week 3 matchup on Monday Night Football to who makes the playoffs over the other one, which is why I chose it. I know it's risky to talk about a early season game as a big like having playoff implications, but I think with the two teams and the way that both the divisions are set up, and with the things that both teams need to fix, it very well could be a play. The winner could get in over the other one when it comes to playoffs.
Interesting. Yeah, I skipped week 3 in my list, but I understand your reasoning there.
That's
Yeah.
fair. And I have one more, and I think this is probably the one that, if not both of you, at least one of you has, and that's Week 11 versus Kansas City. Kansas City and Buffalo have a rivalry. I mean, I think 3 of the last 5, I could be completely wrong about that, AFC championships recently that the Chiefs have appeared in have been against Buffalo and Josh Allen. I think this game will not only have playoff implications, but I think it will be a high scoring and very important game just because of the rivalry between the two teams.
Yeah, that's also super valid. Always a great matchup, usually really high scoring.
Yeah, so I did write down actually a note on the Kansas City Chiefs game. That was one of my notable games. The Bills and the Chiefs have met up for a head-to-head 4 times since 2020. Not all in the AFC Championship, but Kansas City has won every single time since 2020 that they have faced in the playoffs. So, just to add that little tidbit.
Yeah, I'm sure the Bills are looking to get some revenge there. All right, I'll jump into my biggest games. First off, I have week 2 at Miami. Unlike Jack, I think the Dolphins are the team to beat. Especially when you look at the timing of their games against Buffalo. I think those two teams are, just like last year, going to be the top 2 teams in this division. And fortunately for Miami, neither of their games are against the Bills are too late in the season. So they go down to Miami in week 2. I think that's a really big game there. Then there's a 2-game period here. It's weeks 4 and 5 where they're at Baltimore and then at Houston. Obviously, 2 playoff teams from last year, both looking to repeat performances, try to get to the Super Bowl, try to beat the Chiefs out. And so that's a really big series there for the Bills, especially with 2 away games back-to-back. And then I have week 9 where they host Miami. It is worth noting it is in November, but it's early November, which I think gives a little bit more of an advantage to Miami in contrast to the game that they went to last year, specifically the one in the playoffs. Now, obviously, that could happen again, but Miami does tend to do worse in colder weather. It might not be as cold in Buffalo. I say, it's November in Buffalo. I'm sure it's going to be super cold, but it might not be the worst situation for Miami, and I could see them pulling through with 2 wins against Buffalo.
Don't worry, I have notes on that later. Miami in the cold.
Let's jump into Miami next then. Let's just go ahead and jump in. Ben, what do you have as their biggest strength?
Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle combined for over 2,800 yards in 2023, and that's with Waddle having missed 3 games. They will continue to be the playmakers in Miami, and Tua will not fail to get the ball to them numerous times a game. I would say 10 to 20 times per game with both of them combined. Obviously, Cedric Wilson Jr. was their number 3 last year. He left for New Orleans this past offseason, but they did replace him with Odell Beckham Jr., an experienced veteran. He definitely has lost some of his speed over the years, but he still has plenty of play strength left in the tank, and he's going to definitely provide kind of a go-up-and-get-it aspect for the Miami Dolphins this year. Additionally, they drafted receivers Malik and Taj Washington, side note, no relation, in the 6th and 7th rounds, respectively. They're not elite receivers by far. There's a reason, right? They were taken in the 6th and 7th, but they do have unique skill sets, and they both definitely add to that diverse potential that can be very explosive that Tua has at his fingertips. Obviously, at running back, the Dolphins have a very simple request: be fast. Their starter, Raheem Mostert, signed a 1-year extension with the team after rushing for over 1,000 yards with 4.8 yards per attempt and 56% success rate, which, for more casual viewers, a running back averages maybe a 44 to 45% success rate and, 4 to 4.2 yards per attempt. 4.8 with 56 is elite numbers. And Raheem Mostert's always been good, but nothing like that before. Sophomore Devon A-Chain, he seemed primed for a very exciting run last year after putting up almost 500 yards in 3 games. Unfortunately, he got injured, but he is set to return at 100% as a rotational running back behind Mostert. Additionally, Jack mentioned earlier that they drafted Jalen Wright from Tennessee. He wasn't my favorite running back in the draft, but he is the archetype that Miami looks for. Small and fast, but he's not afraid to put his shoulder down and take a hit. All of these players and more, with Tua Tagovailoa on a new contract, it spells trouble for opposing defenses. The Dolphins were second in points and first in yards in 2023, and I expect no less going into 2024. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I put down pretty much the exact same stuff that you talked about. The skill players on their offense. No, you're good. I mean, it is a little bit of an obvious one with the Dolphins. I think they have the best running back duo in the NFL right now, with Mostert and Achane. I think it's worth mentioning that Mostert had 18 rushing touchdowns last season, which is phenomenal. I think they have a top 5 wide receiver duo in the league. It's hard to say if they're number 1. I think Tyreek Hill definitely pushes them up there, but close to the top there. And then, yeah, Tua, I think, has proven himself capable of being an elite quarterback when he's in the right system, when he has the right weapons. And so I think the only thing that could hold this offense back is the potential for injury. Obviously, they've had a lot of players who have struggled with injury in the past. Tua, Tyreek Hill, Waddle, Mostert has a little bit, and A-Chain last year. But as long as they all stay healthy, I don't see anybody stopping this offense. Jack, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I went slightly different route. I said the wide receiving core in general, mainly because I forgot that they re-signed Mostert. I thought he left. And otherwise I would have done skill position. But I mainly put the wide receiving core this because I genuinely think that they have the best receiving duo in the league, which is another bold take. But I think that as long as Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are on this team, you could put anybody back that quarterback and they're going to have 1,000 yards. I really do. I think they are both not only super fun receivers to watch play, but they are so dangerous because of how fast they are. And they only got better, in my opinion, with the addition of Odell Beckham Jr. I know a lot of people say he's washed, he isn't as good as he used to be, and him not being as good as he used to be is definitely a true statement. Like I'm not trying to say he's still a top wide receiver in the league, but he definitely can still make plays. And having him there, where I'm assuming he'll play at number 2, because I believe Waddle has played slot the last 2 years. I think
I'll interject there for a second. Waddle played a lot of slot, but the thing about Jalen Waddle is he is a very versatile weapon, and Miami didn't really play a specific receiver in a specific place.
Fair.
They played a lot of different receivers in different positions.
That's fair. Okay. Yeah. But I think that Odell Beckham Jr. will be the guy that Miami uses as the guy to kind of pull the pressure off of Tyreek and Jalen. Because I do think there will be games where teams will double cover maybe 1 or 2 of them and they'll be locked up, and Odell Beckham Jr. will be able to run a shorter route, maybe 10 yards, come back, something like that, and rack up a whole lot of yards, which will cause the team the following week to pay more attention to him, which would then allow Waddle and Hill to rack up the amount of yards they normally get and play the way they normally play. So I think that that 3 could potentially be the most dangerous wide receiving core in the league this coming year.
Yeah, that's definitely a super valid point. Yeah, like I said, I'm not fully convinced that they're necessarily number 1. I think there's a good chance.
Fair.
But there's a lot of really good duos right now, and so it's hard to say for sure who gets that spot. That brings us up to the biggest.
It's a valid argument for sure.
Yeah.
That
brings us up to the biggest weakness. Kind of similar to a couple of the teams we've talked about. I kind of struggled to find like a really big weakness. They definitely have some weaker points, and I ended up going with the offensive line. There were definitely some injury question marks last season. They've lost a couple of key players, and I just don't feel like their replacements are quite as good as what they had last year. And so I could see the offensive line being a little bit of a question mark. That being said, the style of offense that they run, the quick passes, running the ball really quick, and having such fast players definitely does help ease the offensive line's jobs a little bit. Um, but I'm not fully convinced that the offensive line is going to be as good as last year. Um, Maybe it's close to the same, but I think if it's going to move, it's going to be a little bit worse. Jack, what did you put down?
I also settled on offensive line. I was kind of torn between offensive line and the pass rush. I wasn't a huge fan of Miami's pass rush last season, but I think with the addition of a specific player, which we'll get into later on, I think that pass rush will be a lot better. So I ended up settling on the offensive line. I remember 2 years ago, Tua was constantly hurt with I think like what 3 concussions in one season, and a lot of people were concerned about his health moving into last season and how well he would actually be able to play behind that offensive line. And while he played a lot better, I don't think he had a very serious injury if he got injured at all. I do think that the offensive line could have played a lot better last year than what they did, and that they definitely benefited from having speedy receivers and speedy running backs in the backfield to take a lot of the pressure off of the offensive line and Tua from having to be back in the backfield. So I think unless they really focus on this going forward, this offensive line will still have the same problems that they have, and that they will still see injuries to Tua, even if they aren't major ones, just because of the lackluster O line play they've had the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, I think it is worth mentioning he did play every game last season. He didn't
Right.
get injured um, last season, so that is a good sign. Plus, last offseason, he was really focused on putting on a little bit more weight, and he took a lot of like karate classes and stuff to help learn how to protect his body a little better. This season, I know he's been focusing on losing a little bit more weight and being a little bit more mobile. Um, so he's kind of
It's going to keep
balancing.
going back and forth his whole career.
Right. Yeah. But I think if he keeps improving and he keeps learning these lessons, I think he will continue to improve. Ben, what are your
Right.
thoughts?
I really fast before I jump into that weakness. I have to push back a little bit, Jack, on something you said. You talked about the Miami Dolphins pass rush being not great in 2023, and I struggle to see exactly where that's coming from. Bradley Chubb and Zach Seiler combined for 21 sacks and 44 quarterback hits. Christian Wilkins was incredible from the inside with
Right.
9 sacks. Jalen Phillips was a rotational guy with 6.5. Andrew Van Ginkel and Emmanuel Ogba from the outside had 11.5 sacks together and 28 quarterback hits. Um, and even if you do look at their 2024 team, they lost Andrew Van Ginkel. They lost Jerome Baker, Christian Wilkins. Raekwon Davis was a rotational defensive tackle. But they did keep Emmanuel Ogba around. And then they signed Neville Gallimore, interior defensive tackle from Dallas. And then they signed Calais Campbell, who is, I think, 34 now, but he continues to put up great numbers. He was in Atlanta last year. And then obviously they drafted Chop Robinson in the first round. I think their pass rush is going to be just as good, if not better, this year than it was last year. Anyway, my biggest weakness is the offensive line, just like you guys talked about. You really kind of covered everything I was going to talk about. It's one of those things where the roster remained approximately the same in the trenches for Miami, except for really the free agency trade-off of ex-Titan Aaron Brewer for injured Connor Williams, who had a really gruesome knee injury late last year. And the lack of tangible changes, I agree, for this offensive line kind of spells trouble if the inevitable does happen again, which are injuries, because they always happen in the NFL.
Yeah, and I know one of the biggest, being a Titans fan, one of the biggest issues with Aaron Brewer is he's a little undersized, which isn't really what you want from a center. But they kind of jumped on that opportunity early, gave him a decent contract. So maybe they've got good plans, and hopefully they can work something out with him there.
I will say schematically with the Shanahanian offense, and with the guys that they have next to Aaron Brewer, an undersized offensive or an undersized center, excuse me, isn't the worst thing in the world. Isaiah Wynn and Robert Jones are to his sides, and they're both large, strong linemen. So, of all places for Aaron Brewer to go, Miami isn't the worst, especially with the zone blocking scheme that they're running under Mike McDaniel.
Yeah, that's fair. Since we kind of took your weakness from you, why don't you start us off with your X Factor pick?
Yeah, next time don't take my ideas. Um, so my X factor is actually a little bit of an abstract one, but I said it was the ability to play in cold weather. Just
hmm
some background numbers. The Dolphins have won one one game since 2019 in temperatures below 45 degrees. 45 is not that cold for football. It's cold, but it's not that bad. One game since 2019 in sub 45 temperature is disgraceful. Um, no team in the NFL matches that level of incompetence in semi cold to frigid temperatures. And this is obviously a major setback for a team that wants to be competitive in the playoffs. Last year, they had that 26-7 beatdown against Kansas City in the playoffs. I believe it was the divisional round. That kind of game will continue to happen as long as Miami struggles in cold weather. Um, as we saw in that 26-7 embarrassment, they lost all their speed advantage in cold weather, and that's how Miami plays: is all that motion, all that speed, and when they can't do that, they also seem to significantly truncate their playbook, and they don't really play with a full set of plays and schemes. And unless they can get a handle on this and learn how to play in the cold weather, whether it's run the ball more or maybe scheme up a couple more, behind the line of scrimmage plays, something to make this better, they will not be playoff contenders even from home, because there will be a point that they have to leave and go somewhere else.
Unless they get the number one seed.
Right. If the playoffs run through Miami, that's different. But I don't see Miami getting the number one seed.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Jack, what is your pick for the X Factor?
With the X Factor, I did pick Tua, the quarterback. And I picked him because I think what will win Miami games is if he can stay healthy or not. They have all the weapons. Like I said, I think they have the best wide receiving core in the league. It will just be up to how well he plays, I think. And a lot of that will also be, how well the offensive line plays, to keep him healthy and all of that. But I think if he stays healthy, he could be in conversation again for MVP just because of the plays he has around him. However, I do think that if Tua doesn't play well, it could slow down Miami's offense a lot and could maybe make them finish second or third in the division rather than first or second if he plays well.
Yeah, it'll be like San Francisco with Jimmy Garoppolo versus San Francisco with Brock Purdy. They had a lot of weapons, they had a great offense, but it looked a whole lot better with Purdy than with Garoppolo.
Right.
Yeah, 100%. I also picked Tua. Really fast, I do want to also jump in on that pass rush discussion. I like Jack. I was a big Miami fan last year. I loved watching their games. I thought they were awesome. It also didn't feel to me like their pass rush was that good until you really look at the stats. And I think part of that might be because, for one, they blitz so often. For the last couple of years now,
Vic Fangio defense.
Yeah, they've been one of the highest blitz rate teams in the league for I think the past 3 or 4 years. And so it doesn't feel like the pass rush specifically, like those guys who are your edge rushers and stuff like that, are having as much of an effect. But also they have so many players who are rotating in and out and still performing well that you don't hear the same names over and over and over necessarily. So I completely understand where that perspective comes from. I also had to look into the stats to come to that conclusion. But yeah.
Yeah, and a quick aside on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
It is worth noting that Vic Fangio did depart Miami after 2023. Their new defensive coordinator is Baltimore Ravens defensive line coach and assistant head coach, Anthony Weaver.
Mhm.
And he was an ex-player for 7 years.
Hmm.
I believe he played linebacker,
That
or
sounds
outside
correct.
linebacker, potentially defensive end, something like that. And he's going to blitz a whole lot less. He's a lot more of the Mike McDonald belief of, blanket the field and expect pressure from few. And that's why Miami went really heavy pass rusher in terms of signings this year. Like I mentioned with Calais Campbell, they kept Jalen Phillips as a rotational, drafted Chop Robinson. All of those players are going to rotate in because they're going to be developing pressure with a lot fewer players than in past years.
Yeah, absolutely. Weaver was a defensive end for Baltimore and Houston.
Yeah,
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
there you go.
Um, Anyway, yeah, onto my X factor. I did pick Tua Tagovailoa, and I really think the biggest thing is he got the bag. He just has to live up to it. The contract is phenomenal. Um, he really just has to perform up to that standard. Um, it is worth noting that in his 4 seasons so far, he's passed for just over 1,800 yards, then just over 2,600 yards, just over 3,500 yards, and then just over 4,600 yards, with 11, 16, 25, and then 29 touchdowns. So there's definitely marked improvement every season. I don't really expect that to change. I think he'll have a at least as good a season as last year, if not better as well. Um, I mentioned how he's been focusing on getting better with his body every season. He's really focusing, and they're building the offense to suit him. And so I think we're going to see really, really good things out of Tua. But like Jack mentioned, if he does get injured, they're going to have issues, and I don't see them making the playoffs if it happens very early in the season.
I agree.
That brings us up to our notable rookies. I have one honorable
yeah.
mention just because of his name, and that is undrafted free agent cornerback Storm Duck. Storm Duck.
I was going to say, I knew exactly who you were
I
talking about.
was
Best name of the NFL rookie class
Yeah,
yet.
I was scrolling through their roster and I saw
I
that. I didn't recognize his name, looked him
yeah,
up.
it's
He
a
is
fantastic name.
officially my hero, I think. No, but
Yeah, I can't wait to make him my user in Madden 25.
yeah.
So
My actual pick, though, there's actually two of them, and that is edge rushers Chop Robinson and Mohamed Kamara. Obviously, we talked about the pass rush plenty so far.
Ooh.
Um, I don't know that they necessarily needed a ton more help there, but these are two solid looking players. I've heard good things about them through training camp so far. And I think there's going to be really good opportunity for them to learn from solid veterans. And they could be really serious issues for offensive lines in the future.
Yeah, I'll add to that really quick. Like you said, you're not sure if they're actually needed as much as they were like, luxury picks, but I actually do think they are needed. Like I said, they're going to be running through pass rushers faster than most teams because of the fact that they're not going to be blitzing very much at all. They're going to be running pretty much three, sometimes four guys on the line any given time, and they're going to get more tired quicker because they're expected to produce the same amount of pass rush pressure. Um, and with somebody like Mo Kamara, when I was watching his film, he's really small, he's really undersized, but he has some of the best hand usage I've ever seen out of a rookie coming into the draft ever. And he turns his small size into a tool, which is rare for a pass rusher. He uses his really low center of gravity and his elite speed. I think he was the third fastest defensive lineman in the draft, maybe the third fastest pass rusher, and he uses that elite speed to just blow past linemen. I mean, they don't even know what hit him before he's to the quarterback. So I'm really excited to see Chop and Mo Kamara play in this upcoming season.
Yeah, absolutely. Who did you pick out for your notable rookie?
Yeah, so Mo Kamara and Chop were pretty close to my top, but I ended up taking a second round, 55th overall offensive tackle Patrick Paul out of Houston. Let's start with
Hmm.
Patrick Paul is huge. He is absolutely massive.
okay,
I think he's just under 6'8", and he's like 330 something pounds. Just an absolute freak of nature. He could be the Dolphins' saving grace if their offensive line falls apart again, like we talked about. He is by nature a tackle. He played tackle at Houston. He has that length and agility for tackle, but he could slide into guard if the team needs it because he is that kind of tackle who has that ability to just play all over the offensive line when needed. Due to his, like I said, his length and agility, he's great against speed rushers. His wingspan, I think, is like 7'1" or something like that, which is just wild. But that size hasn't really been developed or trained yet, so he does need some work
That's
before he
big.
becomes a regular starter on that offensive line. When he does, or if somebody like Teron Armstead gets hurt again, he will be an excellent tackle for a long time, so keep an eye out for him.
Yeah, that's a really solid pick. I was looking at him pretty closely for my notable rookie pick as well. So Jack, who did you end up picking?
I went with Chop Robinson. I wanted to narrow it down to just one.
Mhm.
But I went with Chop Robinson. I mean, he wasn't the first. He was the fourth, I believe, edge taken off the board after Leia Latu, Dallas Turner, and Jared Verse. And which I think is fair. I think those other three edges I had him higher on my list for edges than Chop Robinson. But Chop Robinson definitely brings something to his game that the other three don't. I didn't watch a lot of like Penn State game or footage at all last season, but I do remember that I had several people to come up to me and be like, "Hey, have you seen Chop Robinson? I think he might be one of the best edges in this coming draft." And that's kind of how I heard him and kind of started watching some of his film. And once Miami signed Weaver as a defensive coordinator and he announced he was changing the scheme and they weren't going to be blitzing as much, I knew, okay, they're going to rotate a lot more. And having a younger guy like Chop Robinson who could be like the reason that the defensive line plays well specific games when he's in, I thought that made a lot of sense. I don't think he'll be a starter at least immediately this coming year. I think he'll kind of rotate in a lot. But I do think he is the type of player who coming next year, the year before, will take the majority of the snaps and keep up the production throughout his entire career.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, my player comp was for Chop was Robert Quinn.
Yeah.
He has the hands and the bend and the pass rush agility that Robert Quinn has. He's going to need to get a lot better against, strength blockers, and he definitely needs some work because he basically has one move and it's called a swim, pass, bend, and hit. And it's a very like linear pass rush attempt, and it works sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't because he's just depending on that elite athleticism. So I agree with you. He's going to need a little bit of time before he becomes that starter.
Yeah, for sure. I'm personally really excited to see what he ends up developing into. I think he could be one of the top edges in the league in a year, maybe 2 or 3. So that brings us up to our biggest games. Jack, why don't you start us off there?
Once again, I will say divisional games. I didn't narrow it down to one specific team in the division like I did with Buffalo. But I do think divisional games will be important, especially with Miami's offense being as good as they are and them having the potential to win in the division. I think those divisional games will be important. But other than that, I picked one other game, and that other game specifically is Week 15 against San Francisco. And the reason I chose the reason I chose San Francisco is obviously they were the NFC Championship and the NFC champion and the runner-up to the Super Bowl. And I think just as the AFC games are important, the NFC games are just as important. And because it's the end of the year, I think with as good as San Francisco's defense is and will continue to be, and as good as the team is and will continue to be, I think if Miami is not in a place to be able to beat or at least go head-to-head with San Francisco by Week 15, then there might be a bigger problem with Miami than some of us are thinking about.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Ben, what are the games that you picked out?
Oh boy, I'm so excited for this. My notable games are weeks 13, 17, and 18. Those are all late games or late season games. They're all away in hostile and cold environments. Week 13 is at
Hmm.
Green Bay. Week 17 is at Cleveland, and week 18 is at New York Jets. The average
I
temperatures
had
in
the
Green
exact same
Bay,
three picked out.
there we go. The average temperatures in Green Bay in late November are high 30s. The average temperature in Cleveland in late December is mid 30s. And then the average temperature in East Rutherford, New Jersey in early January are low 30s. Those are all games that Miami can't win in statistically. They are 1 in 10 since 2019
Yeah.
in games under 45. Those are all under 45. The odds of them losing all three of those games is very high. And that's three of their, I think, final 6 games. If they lose three like that, there's a very real chance they're sixth or seventh seed.
Yeah, for sure. They're going to have to bring the Miami Heat with them if they want to have any kind of chance at winning those games, or they're going to have to get over this issue in cold weather for sure.
You mean like the weather, not the basketball team, right?
No, they're going to drag the whole
I don't
basketball
know.
team to
Maybe
Cleveland.
Listen, you
maybe
never
that's what they
know.
need.
Maybe it's what they need.
Bring on the moral support.
Patrick Paul would fit right in.
Oh,
Listen,
yeah.
I saw the opening. I had to make the joke. I'm sorry.
No, if you didn't, I was going to. So,
I was thinking it as well. We can't agree on pass rush, but we can agree on the
all right,
NBA.
that wraps up the Miami Dolphins. That's right. Let's jump into the New York Jets. Obviously, had a rough season last year with Aaron Rodgers going down within the first couple plays. Let's talk about their biggest strength. Ben, why don't you kick us off
All
there?
right, so you remember when I said that defense was going to be a theme in the AFC East? Once again, the New
Hmm.
York Jets' biggest strength is defense. When Hassan Reddick gets his new contract and when he plays, the Jets' pass rush is going to be one of the most formidable in the NFL. They've got Jermaine Johnson on one side, and Hassan Reddick is replacing Bryce Huff on the other. Bryce Huff was a good pass rusher last year, for sure. Hassan Reddick is better. There's no question. No argument there. Hassan Reddick is a better pass rusher. And so with those two on the outside, Quinnen Williams is one of the best pass rushing defensive tackles on the inside next to Solomon Thomas. That's going to be a very strong front four. The linebacking core, athletic, bruising players, CJ Mosley and Quincy Williams, who is Quinnen Williams' brother, for those of you who don't know. Those guys are back. They're both healthy again. The New York Jets, very similar to the Buffalo Bills, brought back pretty much the same defense that they played last year. That secondary is possibly one of the best secondaries in the NFL. Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed are elite in both man and zone, with Michael Carter playing the slot. That is a very good cornerback group. The only part that I have even a little bit of concern about is their safety group, being Tony Adams, who was fine as a second year undrafted free agent. It was his first year starting for the New York Jets. And then Chuck Clark is finally returning from 2 years of injury. They gave him, I think, a 1 year deal to come back and play after they didn't actually get to see him play when they signed him 2 years ago. Neither of those safeties is elite. Chuck Clark had the potential to be 2 years ago, but I just don't think he's that player after 2 years away from the game. But with the corner group they have, they'll be fine. They'll be fine. That defense is by far one of the best in the NFL, and they will continue to be. That defense was one of the reasons that they won even 7 games last year. Now imagine how many games they'll win if the offense can actually be a competent offense.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't pick the defense. I'm not fully convinced that they're going to be elite as a whole. I really like certain players. I really like the Williams brothers. I like a couple of their corners. I'm just not fully convinced on the defense as a whole based on what I saw last year. They were definitely good, but they were hyped a lot more last year. And I know a lot of that could be they were on the field all the time with the quarterback play that they ended up having. But I definitely am. I want to see more from the defense, so I wasn't quite able to pick that yet. Um, I ended up going with two individual players. I picked Brees Hall and Sauce Gardner. Both really young players. I think they both have some room to improve overall. But I really like what I've seen from them in their first couple seasons. While Hall hasn't broken 1,000 yards yet or more than 5 touchdowns, he has been pretty much he was almost the entire offense last season, and he was injured in his first year. Um, but I really like his style of play. I love the flashes that we've gotten to see. And so I think he has a really good chance at breaking out this season. Um, and then Sauce Gardner, I actually thought he had way more penalties than he really has. He only had 5 penalties called against him last season. But I've seen him get away with a lot of holding and pass interference. So I really think his only issue right now is just cleaning that up. Good for him that he's gotten away with it. I would just like to see a little bit of a cleaner play from him. He has the talent 100% to make up for it. He doesn't need to be holding on as many plays as he does. So that's who I ended up picking for my biggest strength for the Jets. It's those two players. Jack, what was your pick?
I'm
Yeah, I like
going
those.
to kind of build off what you said. I do think the defense will be good. I'm not willing to say elite. I kind of agree with you with that. There are specific players on the defense who are elite and will make the defense good. I'm just not convinced that the defense as a whole will be an elite defense. That being said, I did pick the offense, but specifically wide receivers, running back, and quarterback. Wide receivers, more than likely the top three will be, or the three starters will be Mike Williams, who's signed with New York this past offseason. They have Garrett Wilson still, and then Allen Lazard. I think while they aren't, I don't think a top 15. Well, I won't say that, but they aren't, a top tier wide receiving core in the league. I do think they are good enough to help the offense move along, and they have Aaron Rodgers throwing to them, which definitely helps. And then, with Brees Hall, I love Brees Hall. He carried one of my fantasy teams last season. So he will forever be in my heart.
The all important fantasy team.
Right. And I had 5 of them. So, but I've always been a big fan of Brees Hall. I think he has the potential to be a top 5, top 8 running back in the league. I just don't think we've seen much from him yet because he was injured his whole first season, and then the offensive line wasn't great last season. And so I think if they can clean up those offensive line issues, he will be a really good running back. And I think he will be better than some of the running backs that are projected to be good this year.
Yeah, for sure. That actually kind of leads right into the weakness that I kind of picked out. I have sort of two. It's one that kind of bleeds into the next one. And my first one is the O-line. Obviously, the O-line has been bad for the Jets for years now. Going back even to the Sam Darnold days, the O-line has just been absolutely terrible. I'm pretty sure in Sam Darnold, I'm pretty sure they were tackling him for the fun of it. I don't think they realized they were supposed to be protecting him.
It's horrible.
And so they've made a lot of moves this offseason. They signed a couple tackles. They've moved people around. But obviously, offensive line is one of the hardest positions to get people to really gel and do well. And as a whole, over the last couple of years, I think we've seen a decline in offensive line quality, or just a leap in defensive line ability. But it feels like offensive lines are declining slightly. And if they don't manage to keep Aaron Rodgers protected, the second half of my weakness for the Jets is their quarterback depth. Underneath him, next up is Tyrod Taylor, who hasn't really been the best quarterback. He's fine. He's totally serviceable. I would take him over Zach Wilson any day. but he's not going to get them to the playoffs. He's not going to win a playoff game if they do get there. And so I really think the O-line has to be better than the last couple of years if they want to have any kind of shot at the postseason.
Well, yeah, and they have done a good job prettying up the offensive line. They did sign Tyron Smith to a pretty big
Yeah.
deal out of Dallas. He replaces Max
Mhm.
Mitchell, who's still on the roster but is now playing depth. Tyron Smith has had his injury issues, but if he can stay healthy, that's a good signing. They also signed John Simpson from Baltimore. He's a left guard. I'm not a fan of Joe Tippmann at center, obviously. I think he got, well, for lack of a better term, tipped over a lot last year. Elijah Vera Tucker at right guard has been great, but then they also traded for Baltimore's
Mhm.
right tackle Morgan Moses to replace their own bust draftee Mekhi
Yeah.
Becton. So I can agree with what you're saying, but I think that it'll be a lot better this year than it was in 2023.
Yeah, I really hope it is, for sure. Why don't you tell us what your weakness is, Ben?
Go ahead and skip me. Mine was kind of, you
Yeah,
kind
that's
of went
fair.
over it with the
That's
depth
fair.
thing.
Okay. All right. Jack, what did you pick out for the Jets' weakness?
I also had two. I did include the offensive line.
Y'all are cheating.
I did include the offensive line in there. They weren't my main weakness for the team. I do
Mhm.
think they could be better, and I do, like Ben said, they did make a lot of moves to bolster that offensive line and hopefully keep Aaron Rodgers healthy. My
Mhm.
main weakness, and this might be cheap. I don't know if I'm allowed to use this as a weakness, but my main weakness is the turf at MetLife Stadium. I think I think we've seen so many injuries come from happen in MetLife strictly just from the turf. I saw somebody arguing. I think it was on the Pat McAfee show, or one of the top, maybe Rick Eisen or something like that. One of the more popular shows, arguing after Aaron Rodgers got hurt week one last year that it was the turf that was the reason he tore his Achilles and not the offensive line. I think both played a big part in it, but I do think that when your quarterback is 40 years old and has been in the league for 20 years, going on his 20th year, you need to be sure he's able to stay healthy, especially when he's a player like Aaron Rodgers. And while the turf will only be a problem at home, it's very possible that he could go down early on in the season because of the turf from being sacked, and now they have to put somebody in like Tyrod Taylor or Jordan Travis out of Florida State because they aren't willing to make the changes they need to improve the field, so to stop injuries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, durability's been an issue for New York for a long time, and obviously there's some, training and stuff like that can help
Right.
improve that. But I
Right.
agree the field is a danger, and I will join a lot of people in saying like that needs to
Right.
change, and advocacy needs to happen for that field to be
Yeah.
fixed.
I say you just burn it down and start over. That does kind of lead right into the X factor that I picked, which is Aaron Rodgers. And it's as simple as the New York Jets season 100% depends on his health and his performance. If he's not healthy, the Jets will be bad. And if he isn't the same Aaron Rodgers that we've seen in the past, the Jets will be bad. I don't really see any other way around it. I think everything hinges on Aaron Rodgers participating and participating at the same level that we've seen in the. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. My X factor is also Aaron Rodgers. He turns 41 in December. The last time he played like the player that he is known for, like the guy that he's known for, was 2021 when he won his second consecutive MVP. If he plays like that, I agree. The Jets will not only be a playoff team, but they will threaten the Bills, the Dolphins, everybody for that top position in the AFC East. But if he plays like he did in 2022 with the Packers, or in 2023 where he played 4 snaps, we're not going to see a competitive Jets team no matter how good that defense is.
Yeah, absolutely. Jack, what are your thoughts?
I also have Aaron Rodgers. I feel like Aaron Rodgers, right now he's the oldest starting quarterback in the league. I don't believe there's anybody over 40 at quarterback starting for a team. And I think he's in the same situation right now. I don't want to compare him to Tom Brady, because Tom Brady's Tom Brady. But I think he's in the situation right now where he is on a team similar to the 2020 Buccaneers that has the pieces they need to make the Super Bowl. They very well could do it. Aaron Rodgers has won, 4 MVPs and a Super Bowl, so he's he knows what it's like to get to a Super Bowl, and he knows what it is like to play at a consecutively high level. I have him as MVP, like I said, because of the injury things. I feel like if he's healthy, this team not only do I think will win the division, but I could see them making it as a 2 or 3 seed in the AFC. It just depends on the health of Aaron Rodgers and how well the offense clicks with Aaron Rodgers, like around him when they're playing games.
Yeah. If we see a 2020 Aaron Rodgers again, 37 touchdowns and, 4 interceptions, I completely agree. They could be second or third in the division. They will be competing for a Super Bowl, and people will be talking a lot about them.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Ben, why don't you tell us who you picked for your notable rookie?
Yeah, so my notable rookie, I mentioned actually a few episodes back that Malachi Corley out of Western Kentucky was one of my favorite receivers in the 2024 class. He was 3rd round, pick 65. I have a couple thoughts on him. I don't think he's a complete receiver by far, but athletically, physically, I think he's one of the best receivers. I love watching him on tape. He's just so fast, dynamic after the catch. He's just a fun player to watch. Think like, prime Tariq Cohen or something like that. He just played, as soon as he gets the ball, he's just a different type of player. He does need to work on his route tree to become a true weapon in the Jets offense. Right now, he's kind of a glorified running back. But the signing of Mike Williams as the number 2 gives him kind of that flexibility to step back, learn the offense, learn a more, filled out route tree before becoming that dangerous target I know he can be for Aaron Rodgers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Jack, what did you end up picking?
I also went an offensive player. It wasn't Malachi Corley. I do think Malachi Corley is a good receiver, and I think he has the potential to develop into a good player in the NFL. But I focused more on the 11th overall pick, Olu Fashanu. He was the 3rd offensive tackle off the board after CJ Latham and Joe Alt. I personally think he's better than CJ Latham. That's just me. Yeah. But like Braden said earlier, it is very hard to not only develop offensive linemen, especially rookie offensive linemen, but it's very hard to get a good offensive lineman who's going to be able to start and day one and be able to have an immediate impact. I did chose him because the offensive line wasn't great last year, and Aaron Rodgers was, on the ground a lot. I mean, well, not a lot. I mean, he had one drive, but he was on the ground.
25% of his snaps.
Right. But I do think, he plays tackle, so he plays on the outside of the offensive line, and he will have to go up against, assuming he starts week 1, he'll have to go up against edge rushers like Joey Bosa and, Joshua Hines-Allen on Jacksonville and some of the better edge rushers in the league. And I think that he can get it done, especially if he develops well. I'm not sure if he's going to be playing right or left tackle. I haven't seen a whole lot. They may have announced it and I just missed it. But I feel like if you take a tackle within the top 15, but especially in the first round, you're kind of expecting them to come in and be able to be an impact player immediately on the offensive line. And like I said, I think he definitely has the potential to do so. And I think if he can come in and be that player, we will see an offensive line that is able to play that much better just because we have a offensive tackle who's not letting some of the best edges in the league get to Aaron Rodgers.
I'll push back on the expected to come in and compete immediately notion just a little bit. I think Olu can come in and produce immediately. in pretty much any offense. But the nice part about what the New York Jets did here was they put him in a position where he doesn't have to. I had a conversation with you, Braden, if you'll remember, shortly before the draft, about kind of like, oh, Tennessee's probably going to take an offensive tackle. Kind of what's my thoughts on rankings for tackles? And in my mind, it was Joe Alt and then Olu. I'm a really big fan of Troy Fautanu, but because of his
Hmm.
positional versatility in terms of he could fit better at guard and he also was a little less well developed, I didn't see him as kind of that top two. But I saw Olu as Joe Alt, just a little less polished off. He has that physical talent. He is
Yeah.
an incredible tackle. He just needs a little bit of development. The nice part, like I said, about
Mhm.
what the Jets did is they signed Tyron Smith and they traded for Morgan Moses from Dallas and Baltimore, respectively. Unless something catastrophic happens between now and September, Olu won't be starting on that offensive line, and that will be very good for his development.
Yeah, I was
Right.
going to jump in and say I also picked Fashanu. Um, I think he has the potential for sure to be a solid starter in the league. But I really think the best thing for him would be to sit and learn a year and be there as an insurance policy if one of their other tackles goes down. That being said,
Yes.
I did pick another rookie specifically for his name. This is the only other one, I promise. Al Blades Jr. It doesn't get cooler than
I don't think I watched him. Where'd he
I
go to
don't
school?
remember. I think he's a safety. He didn't play
Yeah.
much the last couple years, or he didn't have many stats. Let me pull him up really fast. Al Blades Jr., University of Miami.
He went to
Oh, yeah, that's
Duke,
right. Duke is last season.
Miami in 18 to 22, and then
Yep.
Duke this past year.
Um, yeah, you
That's
don't get a
crazy.
cooler name than Al Blades.
I thought you were gonna go with Quantez Stiggers. He's got a pretty awesome name too.
I did consider it. Yeah, but then I saw Al Blades.
That's a pretty
Yeah.
good name. Al Blades. That's a good name. I completely missed him getting drafted. Like I did not
I
hear the
think
name
he was a
till just now,
UDFA.
so-
Al Blades was a UDFA.
Yeah.
Oh, was he? Okay. Got you.
All right, that brings us up to the biggest games. I'll go ahead and jump in and go first. I went pretty simple. I've just picked their first three games. One of them is a really, really big game. The other two, I just think that if Rodgers is going to set the pace, set the tone, and really get this team moving, he has to prove that he's the same player that he used to be really, really early. And so that is
Mhm.
week one at San Francisco.
Yeah.
Obviously, a really tough matchup. Jack talked a little bit about that earlier with the Dolphins. Week two at Tennessee. Obviously, I might be a little bit biased, but I really like what they've done to their secondary, especially. And so, if Rodgers is going to
Yeah.
still continue to be that player who doesn't throw interceptions, that feels like a pretty good test. And then week three, they host New England. Also, a pretty good secondary. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So I really think these are good tests for Aaron Rodgers and that offense to really see what they're going to look like the rest of the season moving forward.
Yeah, I'll chime in really fast. Week one is a rematch of Aaron Rodgers' Achilles tendon versus defensive end Leonard Floyd. Floyd
Yes.
was the player
Yeah.
that tackled
Mhm.
Rodgers on the fateful play 4 snaps into week one. That was a Buffalo game, but Leonard Floyd was a free agent and signed with San Francisco. It was just the NFL's cruel ways to put them against Leonard Floyd again week one.
Yep, absolutely. And Jack, what games do you have as
Right.
being the biggest ones to keep an eye on?
Besides the divisional games, I also have week one. Three main reasons why I have week one against San Francisco. One is because, like Ben said, Leonard Floyd will be back. It will be a revenge game for Aaron Rodgers. It'll be hey, how well healed is my Achilles in all of that. I do think it'll be a good game to watch, and I think it might genuinely be one of the best games of week one to actually sit down and watch. The other two reasons I have it is because it's in San Francisco, and San Francisco is known to be a harder place to play in, I feel like, just because of how hostile their fans can be. And with how good their defense is, I think having a top tier defense to play against a quarterback who's shown multiple times that he can be great is really good, because if he's going to prove that he is still the Aaron Rodgers that we know, the Aaron Rodgers that has won 4 MVPs and has won a Super Bowl, having a test against one of the best defenses in the league and being able to come out with a win should put the league on notice. The third reason, and this I think to me might be one of the biggest reasons, is it's the San Francisco 49ers. And the San Francisco 49ers are very famous for kicking the Packers out of the playoffs when Aaron Rodgers was on the team. And if I was Aaron Rodgers, I kind of feel like I would, no matter what team I was on, I would just kind of be more aggressive when playing them and playing more aggressively, even if I'm not a defensive player. So I could very well see this game coming in and Rodgers having some animosity towards San Francisco for everything they've done to him in his career, and come out and having a game because of San Francisco.
Yeah, that's fair. It's definitely personal for him.
Then the second game I have, this is actually a game that you didn't mention. Ben might have it, I'm not sure. It's actually week 8 at Houston. The reason I picked this is I think it's easy to say that Houston more than likely will win the AFC South. I saw a lot of people saying that they win 13 games. I don't think they'll win quite that many. I think it goes on to what Ben said. I think before we started recording, where he thinks the AFC South will be one of the most competitive divisions this year in football. But I do still see Houston winning that division with 11, 12 games. And I think that game, once again, even though it is early in the season, could be these two teams could be – this game could decide who gets third or fourth seed or second or third seed, depending on who wins the game. And so I very well could see this game being not only high scoring with two really good teams, but having playoff indications and deciding who gets the highest seed and who gets home field advantage for their first playoff game.
Yeah, that's also a good point. Assuming Rodgers is still upright at that point, that could be a really, really solid game.
Assuming he's still upright, that's so mean.
Listen, I'm wishing Rodgers the best. I hope he can get back to playing the sport that he very obviously loves, and has been playing for such a long time. But he is 40. That is old in football years, and coming off such a major injury is it's going to be a really tough uphill battle for him to get back to that point. Yeah. So that wraps up the New York Jets. Let's hop down to the last team in this division, the New England Patriots. The mighty have fallen. They were bottom of the division last year. What are they going to do post Belichick leaving? That's a huge change for them, obviously. So let's dive right into what their biggest strength is going to be. Jack, why don't you start us off this time?
All right, I will. My biggest strength is one that I kind of feel like not a lot of people have really thought about or talked about. And that is overall how young the team is. I don't think anybody expects New England to be a good team this year. And I told you guys this before we started recording. I really struggled to find a biggest strength on this team. But I was looking through their roster, and the average player, most of the players on the team are between the ages of 21 and 28. So I just called it an average of 25. They have a few players who are in their 30s or, higher, 20s. But I think when you have a lot of young players on the team and you have a lot of players who can develop, it is one of those things where the team might be bad, but coming 2 or 3 years from now, you could have several players on the team who develop into really good players. And we could be looking at an entirely different Patriots team in a year or two with almost the exact same roster. And so I think the overall age and youngness of the team will be a strength, if not this season, at least seasons going forwards.
Yeah, that is actually a really good point. I just looked it up. Last season, they were the fifth youngest team, so obviously they were already kind of in that area. And that is definitely it can be a huge advantage for some teams.
Right.
So hopefully they capitalize on the youth of their players and are able to develop them correctly. But yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Kind of playing into that youthfulness of the team, I ended up picking their secondary. I think they've got a couple, more mature players there, guys who have been around for a little bit, but I really like some of the younger players, especially Christian Gonzalez. Obviously, he struggled with some injury last year, but I liked what we did get to see from him. And then obviously you've got players like Jabril Peppers and Kyle Duggar, who are proven players. I know last week we talked about Peppers getting his new extension with the Patriots. And so I really, really like what they've got going in the secondary. I think they just need to build on it a little bit more. And they need the rest of the defense to pull their weight and make their jobs just a little bit easier. And I do have one honorable mention in there who is Matt Judon. Matt Judon's been around for a little bit,
I love
but he
him
continues
so
to
much.
be a dominant player. Yeah, he's so much fun to watch. Yeah, absolutely electric on the field. I couldn't mention a strength without throwing him in there. It just feels criminal to do so. All right, so Ben, what are your thoughts on their strengths this year?
Yeah, so I'll kind of expand on what you said about the rest of the defense pulling their weight. Once again, my biggest strength for another AFC East team is the defense as a whole. They do not have the defense that like the New York Jets have, for instance, but this is a very strong part of their team, and it's set up to continue to grow. They are bringing back all 11 of their week 1 starters. Emphasis on week 1 because in 2023, by the end of the season, they maybe had, I think, 3 of those guys still starting. So you talk about the secondary and how they're very good, but that's the thing is their week 1 starters from last year, who are once again the starters going into 24, were very good. Up front, Matthew Judon and Josh Uche are both very good pass rushers. I think they both had upwards of 5% pressure rate last year. I'll have to double check that number, but I think that's what I read earlier. 5% is very good. Christian Barmore and Devon Godshaw, two very good interior linemen, not as good at pass rushing as I think new head coach Gerard Mayo probably wants them to be, but they are solid run defenders, and I think they will continue to do that in 2024. Juwan Bentley is one of the best linebackers in the league. He's a sideline to sideline type of player, better than Jelani Tavai and Anthony Jennings, who are the other linebackers on the field. But they're all solid players, and let's be fair, the Gerard Mayo, Bill Belichick-esque defense, it doesn't need elite linebackers. It needs good linebackers who the best part about them is secure tackling. And then you already mentioned Christian Gonzalez. As long as he can enter 2024 healthy and stay healthy, he had an electric 2024 while he was still playing. Unfortunately, he tore his labrum. He's across from Jonathan Jones, who I believe turns 30 this year, but he continues to play at a high level. And then, like you said, that great safety duo up top. This whole defense, top to bottom, is very solid if they can stay healthy.
Yeah, I do want to note, not a piece of news that we talked about last week, but Christian Barmore did have a little bit of a health scare, diagnosed with blood clots. So that is something to keep an eye on. Prayers for him. Hopefully he's doing well and getting through that. There's not really a timeline.
Yeah, he did just sign an extension with New England, too.
But no real timeline on when he'll be back either. That's a pretty major issue there, health-wise. So something to keep an eye on for that defense as well. As for their weakness, I kind of put everything else. There's not anything really spectacular, I feel like, about the rest of their roster. Kind of similar to the Bills. They've got a fairly good running back. I like Ramondre Stevenson. I think he's been pretty solid. But then they have just a bunch of wide receiver threes filling out the rest of their offense. And then, of course, they've got some question marks at quarterback with some really young guys, mixed in with a couple guys who have played some but are somewhat mediocre. And so nothing just overly impressive as a whole about the offense from my perspective. What do you guys think about that?
I kind of agree. I didn't pick everything else. I will say that while I did, kind of say that I've had a hard time picking like one core strength for the team. I had a hard time picking a weakness as well because I think the team as a whole is bad. But I did end up settling on the pass catchers because I feel like when you have a rookie quarterback, or at least quarterback uncertainties as a whole, having nobody to throw the ball to is probably the worst possible circumstance you could put any quarterback in, especially if that guy is going to be number 3 overall pick, Drake May. And so I feel as if, while everything is bad on this team, wide receivers might be the worst aspect of it. Going into what you said, they don't really have a 1 or 2 wide receiver. Everybody's just kind of a 3 or 4 wide receiver. And they don't really have like a top tier tight end that they could dump the ball to. So unless they're planning on running the ball every single play of every single offensive drive, I don't see this offense doing anything.
Yeah, Ben, what did you end up picking? What are your thoughts on the pass catchers and the rest of the offense?
I don't see the pass catching core being as bad as you might say. Juju Smith-Schuster is pretty highly paid. He struggled with injuries last year, but when he's healthy, he's not horrible. Kendrick Byrne was also injured for a majority of the season, but he should be back fully healthy. And they drafted Jalen Polk and Javon Baker. And I'll go into detail on Jalen Polk in just a little bit, but Javon Baker, he went in the 4th round, I think 110th. But he didn't play like somebody who was 110th. He plays like somebody much higher. He's a little on the small side, so he's going to be a specific type of player. He's going to fit in specific roles. But I think the roles that he fits in, he's going to be very good in. So I didn't put receiver as my biggest weakness. I think it's a weakness to an extent, but not my biggest one. For me, I put the offensive line. They have a lot of talent potential on the offensive line, but they've struggled as of recently to remain healthy. Mike Onwenu is one of the most versatile offensive linemen in the league. He can play tackle, he can play guard. He's played a little bit of center. Outside of him, though, lots of question marks. Cole Strange and Saidi Sow both played. Cole Strange was a former first rounder. Saidi Sow was a really late rounder, day 3 pick. But they've both been inconsistent, and they both haven't really stayed healthy throughout their careers so far. Rookie Caden Wallace, they drafted him in the 3rd round, 68th overall. I didn't watch a lot of him, but he should start on the left side based purely on talent and everything that's coming out of training camp. But a rookie blindside protector is also always a pretty huge question mark in the NFL. So really the only solid players that they have on that offensive line currently are center David Andrews and Mike Onwenu, who I think is going to probably slot in at right tackle in 2024.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. Yeah, again, there's so little about this team that really makes you go, oh yeah, that's an awesome player. And yeah, I feel like that applies to almost the entire offense, the offensive line for sure. Yeah, so obviously we've all expressed some concerns here about different aspects of the offense, which kind of brings me to my X Factor pick, which is whoever starts at quarterback or whoever plays quarterback for the Patriots this year. Obviously, there's already some pressure on them to succeed, whoever it ends up being. On their roster right now, they have Drake May, who was drafted this year, 3rd overall. Joe Milton, who was also drafted later. I think he was a 5th or 6th round pick. Correct me if I'm wrong. 6th round. And then they also have Jacoby Brissett and Bailey Zappi. None of those guys are really start worthy, at least as of right now from what we've seen. Obviously, Drake May and Joe Milton could be. Rookie quarterbacks are always so hard to tell. We look at Trey Lance being a number 3 overall pick compared to Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant. Obviously, that didn't go how anyone really expected it to. And so it's certainly possible that Drake May gets the starting job if he does well. I've heard a little bit of chatter that maybe Joe Milton ends up taking it either from the start or taking over part of the way through the season if Drake May isn't doing very well. But I think there's a lot of question marks here at the quarterback position, and it's obviously one of the most important positions in football. So whoever ends up starting there's a lot of pressure on them, and it's going to be a really tough position for them overall. Jack, what do you have as your X Factor pick?
I originally had Drake May. because he was, taking number 3. Everybody kind of assumed he would be the starter.
Mhm.
But I changed it not long before we ended up starting
Yeah.
recording because I had seen a report today saying that he hasn't really been performing to expectations during training camp. And they weren't really the happiest with him during OTAs. And so I kind of moved away from it, and I ended up picking Christian Gonzalez as the X Factor instead. I think that the defense is definitely better than the offense on this team. And I think that Christian Gonzalez, assuming he can stay healthy, will be what helps this defense shine and compete with some of the lower end teams, maybe even some of the higher end teams in the league. Um, I mean, obviously he played, I think, only 4 games last season before he ended up suffering a season-ending injury. But in those 4 games, he had 1 interception. He was targeted 32 times. There was 22. It was 22 completions on him, which I think brought it to about a 68.8% completing percentage. But he only allowed 225 yards. And within 4 games, only allowing that little bit, especially with the average of, quarterbacks averaging between like 200 and 350 yards a game, even if they're not a higher end quarterback. I feel like only allowing 22 or 225 yards in 4 games is not as bad as it could be. Not only that, but he did end up getting a sack and only allowed one touchdown within those 4 games. So he was definitely on pace, at least in my opinion, to have a really good year and possibly even win Defensive Rookie of the Year if he could have stayed healthy. And I think now that he's going into year 2, I think he will be that much better of a player. And I think if he stays healthy and can stay healthy, he very well could be the player that this defense rallies around and is able to play better than people expect him to play.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's a fantastic player. Just based on the little bit that we did get to see. I know I mentioned him earlier with the secondary as the strength. Ben, what are your thoughts on the X factor?
Yeah, so for X Factor, I also put quarterback. I will pretty quickly point out that in no point of the process since April 25th or whenever the draft started has Gerard Mayo said that Drake May is going to start. In fact, he's been pretty staunchly against it. He said that Jacoby Brissett's the starter.
Good.
Jacoby Brissett is the starter. Every time anybody asks him, Brissett's the starter. I think
Yeah.
Drake May is not ready to start in the NFL. Um, I've been saying this since I watched his film. I think he's a very good quarterback, and I think he will be a very good quarterback in the NFL. But he really needs that year to kind of watch and understand the NFL first. Going into that kind of though, assuming Jacoby Brissett does start week 1, which something catastrophic would have to happen for him to not start week 1, and if he plays like he can and has in his career, such as his stop in Indianapolis early in his career, he could lead a competent offense. They do have playmakers on that team, like I
Hmm.
talked about with their receiving threats. So it's not like they have the worst offense in the NFL. Brissett could play well enough that they win some games nobody expects them to win. But if he does fail to operate new offensive coordinator Alex Van Pelt's offense up to par, the Patriots could be a pretty painful team to watch, being that they have an elite level defense and not even close of an offense. Though it is worth noting, Alex Van Pelt does run the Kevin Stefanski offense, and he was the offensive coordinator in Cleveland for the time that Jacoby Brissett was in Cleveland as well.
I do want to clarify when I said that it's assumed that Drake May was going to be the starter. I wasn't meaning like within the NFL or on the team. I do know that Gerard Mayo had said Jacoby Brissett was probably going to start. I was talking about more based on all the Patriots fans I've personally spoken to, and I'm not trying to say all Patriots fans think this, but I have spoken to quite a few Patriots fans about Drake May and about the quarterback situation. And most of the ones I've kind of spoken to are kind of the opinion that if anybody but Drake May starts, you might as well just not even play football. I don't know if they're overconfident in Drake May's ability, or if they just are underconfident in Jacoby Brissett's ability. I was just more kind of saying it as a whole of all the Patriots fans I've personally spoken to about the situation.
Yeah, and I ended up picking Drake May as my notable rookie. I think it's kind of obvious, like he's a big deal. He was the third overall pick, but I think the really important thing to consider with him is you look at Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi. They both got compared before the draft, during the draft, and after the draft, a little, at least somewhat, to Tom Brady. And then they both ended up on the Patriots and both underperformed drastically, at least compared to people's expectations. So I think that puts Drake May in a really, really tough spot because I heard him get compared to Brady as well a couple times. Now he's on the Patriots. I really hope that he does not play this season so that he can get adjusted to the NFL. And I know I've said it in the past. I'm generally just not a fan of rookie quarterbacks starting. So I really hope that they sit Drake May, they let him get accustomed to the NFL, and they give him an opportunity to kind of get over maybe the nerves of being compared to Tom Brady and the expectations to live up to the legacy that he left behind for the Patriots. I think that's way too much pressure to put on such a young player. And so I really, really hope that Jacoby Brissett starts the season like they're saying, and that he stays healthy and finishes out the season, and gives Drake May the best opportunity to come in maybe next year or the year after, really establish himself as a competent quarterback in the league.
I agree. I've also never been the biggest fan of quarterbacks starting week one, especially rookie quarterbacks. I think some of them can do it and do it well, and obviously there's some teams that just don't have a choice but to put a rookie quarterback in at week one. But I think when you're a bad team like the Patriots and already don't have that many great pieces on the offense as a whole, putting a rookie quarterback in is the worst possible choice you can make. I know I was talking to Ben in 2021 when Jacksonville drafted Trevor Lawrence. And I don't know if he remembers this, but I flat out told him that I would have kept Gardner Minshew and start him in 2021 and let Trevor Lawrence sit.
Yeah, we agreed on that.
Because I knew that we just didn't have the pieces we needed for him to have a good rookie year. I mean, it didn't help that we had Urban Meyer. But I knew that he wouldn't have had a good rookie year no matter what. And I do think some of that might be some of the reason with the problems Lawrence is having. But I do think some of that stems from him just being thrown in week one of his first season and not really having time to learn how the NFL works. So I'm 100% on board with Drake May sitting as for all of the year if he can, and just letting Jacoby Brissett take it, even if that means finishing with a top 3 pick and having to make a potentially franchise altering pick with that pick if it means that Drake May has time to develop.
Well, we've seen teams build competitive rosters by putting some, key players on the roster, not really necessarily using them immediately, and then picking high. We've got, the Chicago Bears, the Houston Texans, teams that were very bad, even the Cincinnati Bengals from a couple years back, teams that were very bad that developed over 3, 4, 5 years.
I'm not gonna say I don't mean that picking later in the first round isn't good. I don't think there's bad players usually picked in the first round. There's definitely questionable picks or reaches, but I think usually they're with players who were already talked about being taken in the first round at some point. I just don't think that New England is in a place to be picking outside of the top 10 in this coming draft.
Okay, yeah. So next up, let's talk about the notable rookie. My pick was Drake May. I feel like we've already talked a good amount about that. Ben, what was your pick for the notable rookie?
My pick was second round, 37th overall, rookie receiver Jalen Polk out of Washington. Polk was in a pretty crowded Washington receiver room last year. He had to share targets with Rome Odunze, who went 9th overall to the Chicago Bears, and Jalen McMillan, who went 92nd overall to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Um, now Falcon Michael Penix was throwing to them, and because of that, it was kind of tough for Polk to look as good as he could have. If he had been the number one in any other place, I think he would have been a first rounder easily. Um, I believe that he was the second best receiver in that room outside of Odunze. He did struggle with injury in his final year of college, and
Right.
that also affected his draft stock. And the fact that he was 37th with those things holding him back says a lot about him as a player. He has a very complete route tree. He's incredibly impressive after the catch, has a very good catch radius. And I think that it makes him a very good target for Brissett with that offensive line that we talked about not necessarily being very good. And eventually, if Drake May does start, like we talked about him very in depth earlier, he'll be a very good safety net for May as he kind of intros into the NFL.
Yeah, for sure. I saw his name pop up a couple times. I watched a little bit of his film. I really like what I saw from Polk,
Right.
and I think he's a much needed addition to the wide receiver room for the Patriots. Jack, what are your thoughts?
I like Polk. I went a different direction. I still went wide receiver. I just went with Javon Baker out of UCF. He was taken in 4th round
I love Javon
at
Baker.
110. I like Javon Baker. I think he's not big enough to play number one. I don't think, at least, but I definitely could see, especially with how lackluster this wide receiver room is, I could see him coming in and making a very big impact. I would also like to note that I think Javon Baker and Jalen Polk could come in together and make a very good impact at a duo as a whole. I also don't know what they're thinking for the wide receivers, who's going to start, who's going to play number 1, 2, and 3. But I do think that if Jalen Polk and Javon Baker both get a starting spot and are able to line up maybe with Juju Smith-Schuster at the other end, I do think that this receiving core could play very well, especially with a experienced quarterback like Jacoby Brissett throwing to him. I don't think it'll be well enough to help the Patriots, win 8-9 games, but I do think it would be good enough to maybe get him to 6 or 7 if Polk and Baker are able to develop and play well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think probably what the depth chart is going to look like going into week 1 is Juju and Kendrick as the main two, and then Jalen Polk is going to
Mhm.
be that number 3, but I think he's going to get a lot of
Right.
offensive reps.
I agree.
Javon Baker,
Right.
I love Javon Baker. I'm really happy you picked him. I picked Polk just because he's going to actually start on this offense to start, in
Right.
week 1.
Right.
But Javon Baker, I think, will be a starter within a year or two on the New England Patriots offense. And I like him just as much as Polk.
All right, well, that wraps up the rookie. Jack, why don't you tell us what games you picked out as the biggest games for the Patriots?
Okay. I picked, once again, all the divisional games. I don't think they'll have as big of an impact with New England as they will with the other 3 teams, just because New England, I think, is definitely the worst team in this division. But I picked Week 10 at Chicago, mainly because, they'll be playing, at Chicago. They'll be playing against arguably one of, if not the most improved teams from who picked in the top 5 from this past draft. I think, assuming that Jacoby Brissett stays healthy the entire year, I think it's very possible coming to this game that I don't think it'll be quarterback. I don't think it'll be a big quarterback battle, but I definitely could see it coming down to maybe Patriots defense gelling well enough that they could maybe pull off a win or keep the game closer against Chicago than people may be thinking. My second game is week 14 in Arizona, so they're both away games, and I mainly picked this because I think besides New England, I think Arizona is up there as well as my opinion of one of the worst teams in the league. I do think they're a little bit better off than New England is, but I wouldn't be surprised if this team ends up if this game ends up deciding the draft order in some way between these two teams if they do end up being two of the worst teams in the league.
Yeah, those are both interesting picks. I like the emphasis on the draft order there. That could certainly have an impact on the following season. Ben, what games did you pick for your most important games to keep an eye on?
Yeah, so for my biggest games, New England didn't really have a lot of notable games just because they're not going to be a very notable team in 2024, in my opinion. So I picked three games, week 5 and week 12 versus Miami and at Miami. They're important because they're divisional games, yeah. More importantly, it's Jacoby Brissett's return to his former home in 2021, and he does play them twice. So I think that'll be a kind of an interesting little narrative for the Patriots fans who probably don't have a lot of narratives to watch in 2024. And then week 13 versus Indianapolis,
True.
which is also another narrative. That's Jacoby Brissett's game against the team he got his start with. Obviously, he was drafted by New England, but he was traded to Indianapolis after only a year sitting under Tom Brady. And then before he even knew it, he was abruptly taking over for retired Andrew Luck and ended up being the starter for about a year and a half. So those are my notable games just because, there's some narrative for Patriots fans to be able to hold on to and watch in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. That wraps up our deep dive into the AFC East. Super huge thank you to one of our editors, Jack. We have 2 total editors. Jack is one of them. Huge thanks to him for coming on and being a part of this episode. Thank you guys all for watching. If you enjoyed the content, give us a like. Leave us a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that we said. And we'll be back next week with the NFC East. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.